According with the sequence of the speakers, I will introduce first John Lin. John is an architect based in Hong Kong and associate professor at the University of Hong Kong. Together with Joshua Bolchover, he is a director of the Rural Urban Framework, and, which is a research and design platform dedicated to developing sustainable prototypes for rapidly urbanizing areas. The approach combines research into large-scale processes of urbanization with the integration of a local construction practice and contemporary technology into build projects. Is a way that the research context in his current teaching and design is also experienced, and is experienced in the way that living which neither rural or non-urban, but both traditional and modern ways are combined into the experimentation of John work and also his students. After John, we will have Antoine Brés. Antoine is an architect and holds a PhD in urban planning and development from the University of Paris-1, Panthéon, Sorbonne, where he was an associate professor. He has also been a visiting professor at Qinyi University and Shanghai University. He is a researcher associated with the Geography, Cité, and the AUSser laboratories, and a practitioner with the Brés Memorial Office. His work focuses on grain and the frame of territories in a perspective of ecological transition. His field studies are the spaces inherited from the rural suburban areas or new type of countryside, apprehended as a discrete figure of a general urbanization. His research and work cover both alternative mobilities and a diversity of the spatial distribution of a human settlement, and more recently, the notion of locality approached through the prism of the ecological transition. He was awarded with his partner Beatrice Mariol in 2020 with the Medal in Urban Planning and Development of the French Academy of Architecture. And Qinyi Zhang is an architect and urbanist in the studio Paola Viganò since 2009, a leading designer and a project manager responsible for urban and landscape projects, metropolitan vision, and exhibition. He is currently the coordinator of the interdisciplinary design team in the two large ring parks in Antwerp. From 2018 to 2020, he was a postdoc researcher at the LabVIEW and Habitat Research Center in EPFL Lausanne, working on research projects including the consultation Greater Geneva and the transit-oriented development for inclusive and sustainable rural urban regions, a Marie Sklodowska-Curie action, innovative training network project. He has been invited as a jury member and external critic in a master program and workshop in Europe and China, and received a diploma of PhD in urbanism at UAV Venice in 2018. And his thesis Elements in Desakota Yangtze River Delta, China was partially exhibited in the collateral event Horizontal Metropolis, the Venice Biennale 2016. And Cristiana Mazzoni is a panel chair of our webinar on symbiotic urbanism. She's an architect, urban planner, graduated from University Institute of Architecture of Venice, and a doctor in urbanism and planning from the University of Paris-8. She has been teacher at the ENSA Paris-Belleville and ENSA Paris-Marrakech, and visiting professor at the University of Genoa and the Hafen City Universität in Hamburg, Qinyi University, and also professor at the National School of Architecture in Strasbourg. She's a co-founder of the CMYT Urban Architecture Workshop with Yanis Siomis. And since September 2018, she has been professor of HDR in Town and Territories at the Ecole Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture de Paris-Belleville, and the director of the Joint Research Unit UMR AUSser. Welcome, Cristiano. So we could start with the presentation of John, and we can follow with Antoine and Qinyi, and we leave at the end space for discussion. Thanks everyone for joining, and sorry for this little delay.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so the title of this talk is Making Architecture in a Place Without Architects. And of course, the title refers to an exhibition by Bernard Rudolphski in 1964 at the Museum of Modern Art. And this idea of revisiting and looking for the first time at cases of what he called actually vernacular, anonymous, spontaneous, indigenous, or rural architecture. And what I think is quite interesting is if you start to look at this, these terms mean very different things. So revisiting architecture without architects, we began to think about, what does this mean as a design process? Not only as a kind of formal architecture, but a design process which is about utilizing a collective language. So you could say that each of the houses is different, but somehow there's a participation in a common language for architecture. It's also that traditional architecture is a reflection of social structure. It's a pure reflection of the relationships between people. So this might look very chaotic, but it's highly detailed and highly precise as an organization. In this form of architecture, there's a kind of balance between the collective and the individual, where, for example, this in Casablanca, a protection of these individual courtyards while creating a collective. And it's highly spontaneous, it's highly creative, it's very adaptable, this form of architecture. You can see here, extremely diverse. So there's a certain kind of ingenuity that is inherent, I think, in the human condition. Two different straw roofs, very different expressions, and not that far apart in location. It also, this form of architecture challenges our values. Rudolphski, of course, admires this idea of the tent architecture for the kings. It's temporary and yet it's extremely luxurious. Or in this one, where the detail of the weaving, the effort placed into the pattern making of this chief's tent is what gives the value to the architecture, an architecture that comes from a kind of effort. And this question of the collective is something that I feel like really is particularly pertinent in the world today. But what is architecture with architects today? So this is the beginning of a kind of research where we began to revisit many sites of vernacular architecture. And we began with this photo. This photo was taken by a German photographer flying over Shaanxi, which is in northern China, and it's the underground houses which are dug directly into the earth and hollowed out to make these homes, farmlands above and living underneath. But if you go there today, well, it looks like this. So you have factories, which are also part of the village industry, that are weaving between the underground houses. The houses still exist, and people are building also their own houses above ground. There is a kind of collision between different forms of livelihood. If you think about the nomadic tent settlements, where architecture is essentially following the sort of livelihood of these people. And if we go to Ulaanbaatar, and this is something that my partner Joshua Bokover, he's begun to work on, you see this, which is the Ger districts. And it's an entire settlement made of nomadic tents. And in recent years, because of extremely cold winters, various reasons, the nomads have been just simply coming to the city and occupying the majority of the land in these Ger districts. There's no running water, there's no infrastructure. It's completely informal. If we consider the fishing towns in southern China, where the boat is both a vehicle for livelihood, but it's also literally the architecture of the town. And as you move from boat to boat, they become also part of the public space. While now, as the livelihood has changed to fish farming, an entirely new form of architecture is literally being invented. A kind of establishment of a city on the water. So you have China mobile shops, you have kindergartens directly built onto the water. This is a picture from the Middle East, but it really resembles the kind of fortress towns which are in southern China. So we were really amazed by the impact of urbanization onto these ancient forms of architecture. So the walled cities, the tulos in southern China, they've become swallowed up with individual houses. So people are no longer interested in living collectively, but choose to build individual houses. And rather than a kind of, these tulos were almost a kind of urban structure in the rural. Now they've become these remnants of rural structure, which are embedded in the urban. But this is not just a physical change, it also represents a kind of social transformation. So the tulo, I don't know if you're aware, but families used to live in a vertical stack and you would defend your section of the wall. But when everyone wants a modern kitchen and toilet, what happens is that the easiest way to build that is to simply divide up the common space and everyone builds their own kitchen and toilet. And so here you have a conflict again between the sort of needs of the individual and the needs of the collective. There's a material transformation. So here you have in Japan, traditional straw houses, and this is a modern one. This is a photo collected from a research studio I led, where a student found this house on Airbnb. And it's a collision between a kind of traditional craft and also industrial material. But it also represents a kind of loss of social engagement, where the making of the house is traditionally the most important social activity that knits a society together. So we're interested in this in China because it's really because of its rapid urbanization process. There becomes a collision between modern and traditional forms of living, between infrastructure and agriculture. Where does the architect fit in in this collision, I guess? And a more important question is, how can the architect participate in this evolution of architecture with the architects? So I'm going to move on to some of the recent research, which has just been published this year in a book called As Found Houses. This is a research that I've done with my colleague, Soni Devabhaktuni, who's also at the University of Hong Kong. And we began as architects not to design, but to simply find cases where villagers themselves have adapted and have transformed their traditional houses. So they've begun to, you could say, react to this paradox of urbanization, to this kinds of conflicts or collisions, and they've begun through the adaptation of the house to somehow ameliorate and to connect and to make sense of these conflicts. This is the first house that really inspired our research, which was in the underground houses. And a couple had simply built a new house above ground. But what we found was that they were moving underground in the winter and the summer months. So underground where it's warmer in the winter and it's cooler in the summer. And then they moved above ground in the spring and the fall. This was extremely interesting because it really demonstrated an idea of sustainability as well, a kind of sustainability, not through technology, but through adjustments to one's lifestyle. And we began to look at many other places. So we visited around. And we found that often the underground house and the above ground house were connected in unusual ways. And of course, here's some very extreme transformations to the landscape. You have these underground houses literally side by side with new high-rise housing. So this family started to adapt their house to become a restaurant. So the commercialization of the house, then designing and digging a driveway directly into the house itself. Probably in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through every single case study, but just to kind of sample. And what we did was we began to draw them. So in this town where the earth is very soft, when they build the highway, they actually cut down into the earth. You can see here the house on the left and the house on the right. There's 3 houses along the road. Well, the middle house is the only one that doesn't just simply excavate the house and build a house along the highway. They actually left it and built instead a new shop front. So you enter directly from the street, there's a store, but then in the back, you have still a very traditional underground house. A kind of marriage between commercial and domestic living. And we began to draw them as architectural ideas. So we thought about these things as very valuable new typologies that we could learn from. We went to other areas, for example, in the middle of China, where there's the largest community of wooden house builders. The traditional wooden house is still being built alongside concrete and brick houses. And one of the interesting things is that traditional architecture is very resilient. The house can be easily taken apart. It can literally be loaded on a truck and you can buy a wooden house for, I think this house, the material costs about 10,000 RMB, which is roughly, I think, a little over 1,000 euros. And what's interesting is that these wooden structures have become combined with concrete structures. Interesting details. And you have a kind of landscape where the wooden house is being recycled back into newer houses. This was the first house that we encountered, where they built the highway. And this time the highway is built 4 meters above the ground because this is a kind of wetlands. The farmland is below. And so they simply built a concrete frame and reassembled the house. If you look very closely at the image on the left here, you'll see that every single board is labeled, and that's because of when they took it apart, then they knew how to put it back together again. A very simple adaptation where the brick wall simply wraps the wooden house, and you have both modern and traditional facilities. Or this one of my favorites, just simply rebuilding your traditional wooden house on top of a newer concrete and brick 2-story house. This will eventually become the living spaces afterwards. So of course, I've always been interested in, the premise of the horizontal metropolis and, having participated in your workshop before, because of the way that it looks at and considers all the different scales of urbanization, that the urban doesn't exist only at large scales, but it exists in the very detail. This is something I'm very interested in. Where is urbanization felt down to the last detail, and how can we act within this urbanization process? So we've looked at collective houses as well. Again, I talked about these. These are the two lows, collective living, and how they expanded it by building a ring or even directly plugging in the house. For me, this is quite fascinating because here you, on the left, you see the doorway between the traditional part of the house that faces the collective courtyard, and then an individual house, which is built directly towards the outside. So you kind of have the best of both worlds. Or seven brothers that simply rebuild each section of their own house, keeping the collective space, but changing the style of how they want to do it. I'm going to skip ahead here. Anyways, as you know, the book has been published, so it's easy to find. And the last site we looked at was in Shangri-La, which is in the Tibetan area of China. And it used to be a town full of mud, traditional rammed earth and wood. And now it is a town full of glass and steel. Oh, and for some reason it's a bit frozen. And an entirely new industry of glass and steel sort of summer rooms, almost like greenhouses, have been built and have begun in this area. So I'm quite interested in how even the adaptation of the house creates its own industry. And they become so large that they can wrap even the entire house. They can be bigger than the house itself. The climate allows for this. These innovations are interesting because you can almost trace them back to the original one. This is the original first house that did it. You see the back, which is the mud house. They chopped it in half and built a sort of sunroom, a glass and steel sunroom. So you see here in this space, and you can really see also, it's an expression of how the way people live, and there's a seamless integration between a traditional lifestyle and a modern lifestyle. So this doesn't just occur and impact the architecture, it goes hand in hand with the kind of social and lifestyle transformation. This is the last house I'll show. It's a house of a kind of a local businessman. And he starts his morning up here in this breakfast room. You can see the floor is glass because then in the afternoon, he spends his time here playing mahjong. And in the evening, the room below is a completely traditional room where all 13 members of the family gather at the end of every evening. So we became quite good friends, and I spent many evenings in here with the entire family. And it was just amazing that these two ideas of life could coexist so well and be reflected in the house. Okay, I would like to show one simple project. It's a video, and then I'll end after that. I think I have a little bit more time. Okay, so yeah, that's about it. And in a way, to conclude, it's really about, I think, adaptation and, you know, and this kind of, yeah, this space which is neither urban nor rural. We're doing a lot of housing projects now, actually, that are also, you know, balancing between house and housing and rural and urban. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zhang, for this very interesting and fascinating presentation. We move now to Antoine. Please,
Yes.
Antoine, feel free to start at your best convenience.
Thank you. Let's share my screen. Do you see the presentation? Yeah, okay. Good. Thank you for your invitation first. My work is mainly focused on the areas of scattered urbanization inherited from the rural, including the outskirts of French metropolis like Paris or Lyon. Generally, scattered urbanization has been studied through the practices like mobilities, assuming that people move a lot, driving their car or using public transportation. But few people, as Thomas Sieverts or Klaus Humpert, Terry Maggi, or Bernardo Secchi and Paola Viganò, were interested in the morphologies of that kind of urbanization. Those three researchers gave me the opportunity to explore the patterns of scattered urbanization at the proper scale. It means at the local scale. The first part of my presentation involves the background of those researchers, the generalized urbanization. Then I explain the method and the tools of the bottom-up approach used to explore contemporary processes of urbanization in two different metropolitan outskirts of Paris and Lyon. As we'll see, it means a double change in the way of looking at those metropolis. Then, with the concept of granularity applied to the Great Paris metropolis, we'll try to highlight the urban pattern of the Paris outskirts and the process of their growing during the last 50 years. In the same way, we'll see that accessibility to facilities mainly works independently of Paris center. Hereafter, with the second concept of extended locality, we will focus on activities related to the ecological transition within the same regional samples. Then, I conclude my presentation with the importance of adopting these two sets of interpretative lens, as said Edward Soja, to get rid of city-centric point of view and to manage a rich, diverse, and sustainable metropolis. First of all, I need to introduce the background of these works. The key feature of this background is what I called in the 70s generalized urbanization by the French sociologist Henri Lefebvre. Then, more recently, by Neil Brenner in his book Implosion, Explosion. As said Thomas Sieverts or Neil Brenner, in the two quotations on this slide, it would be a mistake to reduce urbanity to cities and metropolis to their very dense center. General urbanization drives to the second issue, the dilemma between concentration and dispersion, or in the same way, between centrality and density. In the common sense, metropolis looks like a spot which is expanding from its center. That's what is usually called urban sprawl. But in fact, as we'll see, two dynamics work together, one of concentration in the center of big metropolis and one of dispersion in between the metropolitan areas. In this way, the demography of French countryside population is increasing faster than the metropolis one, even in the far rural areas in the very center of France, and faster because of the coronavirus. It means that, as Edward Soja pointed, we need to use a different set of interpretative lenses to bring out significant contemporary metropolitan patterns. To explore those two dynamics in the Great Paris and Lyon at the relevant level, to look as well at the morphology as at the centralities, we adopted a bottom-up approach of space and networks based on a double change in the way of looking at the metropolis. First, a change of reference framework. The city is no more in the center of this framework, but at its periphery, and the center is nowhere or everywhere, as we'll see. Then we need to zoom on each human settlement, whatever is its size, village, small town, even hamlet, what I call built aggregates. As we'll see, this double change in the way of looking at the metropolis outskirts gives the opportunity to highlight the great diversity of scattering patterns. The leading principle of our work is to substitute to a large-scale approach based on the urban spot, an approach based on the discontinuity of urbanization inside a sample, a square of 50 by 50 kilometers, including no town of more than 20,000 people. We call it a regional window. This slide shows the different steps of the exploration of a regional window. First layer on the bottom, the built-up areas. Second one, the aggregates created from a 100 meters radius buffer around each built-up area. The third one, the grains, combining morphology and demography, aggregates and human settlements, and classified into different categories: hamlet, village, bourg, and towns. On this basis, we are going to see how those built aggregates are more or less scattered, how they grew up, how they work together regarding the shopping facilities. Those two pictures of the southeast part of the Île-de-France region, you have Paris on the left upside, more or less the Seine-et-Marne department, clearly reveals two opposite ways in representing urbanization. What we see on the left is a city which is expanding along the main transportation networks, with in between the main towns some areas that look empty. On the contrary, on the right side, we see a lot of built aggregates or human settlements scattered all over the countryside. It means that the issue is not how the city is spreading as oil stain, is splitting up, is crumbling, but how built areas are aggregating in a way more or less clustered or scattered, more or less continuous or discrete. We saw the granularity is based on the shift from built-up areas to human settlement. Granularity characterizes in a given space, here a regional window, the distribution of its inhabitants within the different kinds of human settlements. The categories of human settlements come from rural geography, even if they are not easy to define. Our categorization is the following one. Hamlets include less than 50 inhabitants. Villages include from 50 to 500 people. Small market towns from 500 to 2,000 people, and towns include from 10 to 20,000 people. Here we see two regional windows with deliberately contrasted granularities, Île-de-France and Limousin. In Île-de-France, half of the population lives in about 100 small towns. In Limousin, half the population, which is 4 times less important than in Île-de-France, lives in 500 hamlets and villages, and there is no big towns. Looking at the process of urbanization during this half-century, while the population of our sample in Île-de-France increased by 100%, from a little more than 110,000 to 240,000 people, each aggregate grew up whatever was its size. Every village, small town, even hamlet grew. Some villages became small towns and others bigger villages. Hamlets became villages by themselves or by grouping together. Small hamlets or villages were joined, then included in small towns. It's not urban sprawl, it's a kind of fractal growth which concerns every aggregate. We used the same bottom-up approach to check accessibility to the shopping facilities. We started by locating facilities of different kinds in the built aggregates. Then, with the GIS, we calculated the shorter distance between each aggregate and the various kinds of facilities, beginning with daily facilities like convenience stores or bakery, then weekly facilities like drugstore or hairdresser, then rare stores. We got those patterns that we call proximity clusters. They are theoretical figures, but they give a good idea of local organization inside the areas of scattered urbanization. We notice that those clusters work with short distances and mostly independently from the nearby cities. Looking at the average distance from each aggregate to the different kinds of facilities, we notice that those distances are very short. The average distance to everyday facilities is 3 kilometers. The average distance to weekly facilities is 4.5 kilometers. It means that those trips could be done with a bike if roads will be suited to soft mobilities. Regarding the proximity clusters of the regional windows, Île-de-France and Burgundy near Lyon and Chalon, their number and their shape are very diverse too. 100% of the Burgundy villages have a daily store and less than 60% in Île-de-France. The second concept, the extended locality, concerns the relationship between these discrete patterns of urbanization and the ecological transition. The focus was to deepen the relationship between sustainability and locality, which is often taken for granted. Using the same bottom-up approach, we listed all the activities working towards the ecological transition within those regional windows. These activities concern agriculture and food, here in green, housing and energy in red, culture and training in blue, and the social and solidarity economy in yellow. We have thus identified a very large number of activities and their dispersion throughout the regional windows. The first observation is that there are more activities regarding the ecological transition in the countryside than in the nearby cities if related to their population. The second observation is that those activities tend to develop in small towns, in Burgundy, for example, in Qinyi and Tournis, two small historical and tourist towns of 5,000 inhabitants, located halfway between Lyon and Dijon. Then, on the basis of surveys with some of the stakeholders of those activities, in order we tried to understand how they work, and in particular the scale at which they were developing their activities, we found a very practical relationship to distance related to an ecological concept. If we claim to be ecologists, we must limit the distance we travel by car. Most of the activities have been set up within a first perimeter, what we call a proximity perimeter, of about 10 or 20 radius. The goal of the stakeholders is not to make their business bigger and to go further, but beyond a certain threshold, their goal is to encourage other people to develop a similar activity, and thus to create a kind of archipelago of sustainable activities. It reveals a bottom-up logic through the progressive aggregation of local-led actions. In this case, this concern to work locally does not prevent the local from being connected to the international or to the regional. That's why the concept of network is often used by the stakeholders on a local, regional, national, and international scale. As we see on this slide, at the local level, the network brings together various activities through both functional and personal links. On a regional or a national scale, the network allows the stakeholders to take advantages of sharing services and tools, mainly digital tools. It represents a strength to defend a shared vision of ecology and sustainable development. Those few slides and the two concepts of granularity as an extended locality introduce a lot of issues and two different sets of interpretative lens of Metropolis. First, through granularity, what is obvious is a strength of inherited rural patterns. Most of these settlements were already there 5 centuries ago, some smaller and some bigger, but at the same place. And because of their rural background, scattered urbanization patterns look more diverse than cities' ones. This implies paying a lot of attention to them, and much more in proportion than to big towns. Till recently, it was contrary. Then, through extended locality, the ecological transition introduced an inversion of point of view and gives back all its importance to open and productive spaces. Granularity and extended locality are questioning the center-periphery hierarchy. It claims for an approach that is no longer city-centric, but rather horizontal and diversified, that highlights how each area of the metropolis can contribute to the common good. Because of the existing and potential symbiose that can be observed between human settlements and their non-human environment, suburban outskirts could bring a major contribution to the ecological transition of the metropolitan area. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Antoine, for your presentation and the way that aligns in continuity with the presentation of John through a different scale. We move now to Qinyi Zhang. Please, Qinyi, feel free to start.
Okay. The title of my talk is Elements in Dakota. it was my PhD thesis. It was focused on Yangtze River Delta in China. The Yangtze River Delta is one of the most populated area in China, but at the same time, one of the most important agriculture production base in China. It's well known for its rapid urbanization and the giant cities, the metropolitan areas like Shanghai, Hangzhou, and Suzhou, and many other cities. I start with the reflection by Terry McGee on this territory. In the 1991, he was looking at China, and he was considering the delta of Yangtze River Delta as a Desakota area. Desakota meaning, in very simple explanation, half nature, half rural and half urban. So at that moment, he saw two types of paradigms. The first one is an urbanization that really is happening in the fields, where you can see the industrialization and higher density of settlements are happening in between the original agricultural tissue. And at the same time, he was also he has the observation that big cities are coming. This is where you can see the development of Kunshan, a famous industrial city next to Suzhou and Shanghai, how the city is taking over all the agricultural areas around it. So at that time, he posted the question, is the Desakota a transitional, let's say, phenomenon, or it will be abandoned in the future and taken over by the city-centered paradigm? In 2007, he wrote another time about the Desakota, and there he also saw, since the 1990s and the 21st century, obviously, the city-centered paradigm were really taken over in China, and he was ready to admit that the story of Desakota is going to its end. But is it really true? So I start to look at the Yangtze River Delta, following the question by McGee in the 90s. On the left, you can see the 250 by 250 kilometer frame of the Yangtze River Delta. It's basically overall urbanized area. To understand what is happening, how it was made, and from where we can imagine a future, I start to take a very small piece that is 3.2 kilometer by 3.2 kilometer, or 2 miles by 2 miles, the scale of the Broadacre city by right, just to take a piece like a biopsy of a big body, to understand how what is the construction of this territory. In fact, it looks like this. Maybe you have seen similar photos from John's presentation and also Paola's presentation weeks ago. It's simply a countryside that is beyond the traditional definition of the rural area in China. There are not the poetic, beautiful farmlands with lakes and rivers. It's on the contrary, a patchwork of high density housing and industrial platforms. You have agricultural lands in form of fish ponds, orchards, rice fields here and there, a hyper-mixed situation where you can say it is really a city in the field. If you go closer, you see on the left a kind of a traditional, let's say, city-centered development to have high density city next to the agriculture. But you can also find cities in the field where the 3 floors of the traditional, let's say, not traditional, but the 3-floor houses in starting from the 80s is replaced by 5 to 6 floors, gigantic houses. So how to understand this situation? I start with the notion of elements. The notion of elements is coming from 2, let's say, sources. The first is the territory is made by elements, especially the agricultural base, which determines the density of the population and all the urbanization that afterwards is based on a unit or an element called, you can say it's very similar to the European or Western idea of polders. They are very tiny polders where closed by dikes, and in the middle you have agriculture. On the edges you have the human settlements, also where the bridges are constructed. So the territory is made by immense amount of these elements. And also the other source is the notion of elements in the field of architecture and urbanism. Starting from, it's not a new notion, it's a notion also from learning from Las Vegas, from Grigotti, reflecting on the elements of the territories. Also, Paola Viganò book, The Elementary City, to analyze the industrial cities in the terms of different elements, sideworks, gardens, fences, roads, buildings, entrances, and so on. It's a notion that before interpret a territory, we take a step back. We start with really elementary things. And of course, the idea, as we are designers, the idea is also through those elements, through the conceptualization and transformation of elements, the territory can be transformed. So I was not only interested in the writings and practice of architects, but also, so here you see other examples of the works by, for example, Frank Wright and the Disturbanists in Russia, represented by Okitovich, Ginsburg, and so on. In their works, apart from the big concepts of a society, a territory, a city, all those qualities and, let's say, the social agendas are delivered through certain specific elements: how to design a school, how to design a house, how to design a garden. And this notion is not only practiced by architects, but also by writers, by thinkers, by politicians, through their writings, through their political agendas. So the spatial agenda and the political agenda through elements can be connected. So from these 2 aspects, I started the exercise on the analysis of this Desakota from the elementary point of view. So I took this 2 miles by 2 miles piece of territory, and I start to draw the different things. This is an example of water. So it's in fact a city of water. You see the different polders, but you see also an incredible amount of fish ponds that are represented in gray, in light grays, that are scattered within the polders. You can be also surprised by the fact that it's also a city in the forest, where you can see here represented in pink all the orchards that are built after the 80s around the perimeter of each polder, where you have the dikes, which can be already a part of the construction of the fish pond. You can also be surprised by the amount of buildings that are in this territory. Here you can see the number, the houses, but also in gray, the attached volumes that are used for each house for their, let's say, industrial production, domestic industrial production. And at the same time, you see small, tiny industrial platforms, factories, and then you can also see bigger, let's say, town scale industrial parks. Then I start also to overlap these different elements to understand the interrelation between the different elements. For example, here you can see the element of asphalt roads. The asphalt roads are not at the perimeter of each polder, which is already occupied by houses. They are new, they are put in the modern era. That's why they are going in the middle of each polder, and they're connecting, therefore they are connecting the industries that are scattered in the territory, because the industries are built in the middle of the polder where it's wetter than the rest, and it's for agriculture is less valuable. So it becomes a structure that is, it's a combination of a certain type of roads and a certain type of program overlapping on the historical structure of the territory. And here you see another logic, a different type of road that is made by concrete, and they're all on the perimeter of the polders. They're connecting the different houses, and they are enlarged into 4 courts or small placettes in front of the houses. You can also see a growth of industry. This is quite surprising. The usual story we know is that the large industrial platforms are taking over the small industries in the villages, but here you can see not only the town scale industries, but also the small factories and even the small volumes that are attached back in the house, at the back of the house, are also increasing. Of course, the research also includes a lot of field works, photos, and so on, where you can see the different type of road. For example, the road in the industrial platforms, they're already very city-like, and you see the transformed, let's say, asphalt road. They were county roads with also all the very vertical trees that were in the collective period. It was representing the power of the community, and you also see the different concrete work. They are following a different logic and so on. And also maybe this is also related a little bit to John's work, the analysis about the architecture. Here you can see how the, let's say, the traditional courtyard houses gradually being replaced by the, this kind of giants in the context of the rural area in China, where you can see the how the ground floor is being rented out for restaurants and other activities. The first floor is owned by the owner, and those volumes are completely detached and even separated to the upper floors, which is 3 floors of apartments, which is rented out for the people coming from different parts of China to Yangtze River Delta to work in the industries that I have shown you before. So you can also see those kind of buildings with the ground floor that is for the activities, and then a monumental entrance staircase to the first floor where the owners are living, and then in the back separate stairs for the people that are working in the industries to live. What I've shown you is a small part of the analysis of the elements. Then we start to zoom out. Here you can see not a 2 mile by 2 mile, but a 50 by 50 kilometer frame. It's a deliberately chosen frame that is in between all the big, let's say, nodes where you can see the big cities. But on the right, you can see really a gas-like urbanization. And this is representing more than 2/3 of the territory of the Yangtze River Delta. And through mapping the elements that I have shown you in the smaller scale, in the bigger scale, we can understand the transformation in a bigger scale, but really through these elements. For example, in the middle, you can see in the black, the modern fish ponds. They are taking over the, let's say, the organic, traditional Orchards-Dike fish pond model. And they're really, through the transformation of the fish pond itself, a big part of the territory is being transformed. And it brings a lot of problem of maintenance of ecology and even economy. I will skip this part. And by drawing all the trees at a 50 by 50 scale, you can see the amount of trees. You see a city in the forest. You also see a potential of incredible potential to have a high quality life in this territory. And you also see the different type of roads. On the left, you see more, let's say, the concrete roads that are more related to the gas-like industry. But on the right, you see the asphalt road. They are forming a kind of a structure. They are connecting all the, let's say, micro and middle-size industrial platforms. And they have a good dimension of grades. It's more or less 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. Therefore, there are proper spaces to imagine a public transport system which has never been systematically implemented in this territory. So from there, I started the imagination to have a city in the field, a city which can absorb the populations, and they are in fact absorbing the populations that are coming from the rest of China to the more developed area. So here you can see a transformation of this asphalt road into public transport backbones, but also connected to the transformation of certain industrial programs into public facilities. And you see the vertical trees are kept for the character of this type of roads. And then you can also see the concrete roads are transformed into waterfronts, public space that are connecting the different scattered settlements, and also all the small facilities like schools, research centers within the area. So in the end, there is a drawing of the overall imagination of the city in the field, and you can see maybe much better in the exhibition the details of the model as part of the Horizontal Metropolis exhibition. The last slide, I would like to just open a little bit about what I'm thinking now. The cities was made 3 years ago. At that moment, I was more focused on the quality of the elements. I was shocked by when it was also my first time to come to the modern, let's say, rural area in China. And you can see the two photos on the left, a concrete road, a typical rural road in China, and on the right you see in Antwerp, for example, in the countryside, how the roads are made, how the bicycle path, the trees, the hedges and everything is much more articulated, and that's why it has a more urban quality. I was more interested in this aspect, but in the light of climate change and environmental crisis, and also from some of the practices that Andrea mentioned, that we are making big landscape projects in Antwerp, where we are making parks on top of the capping of highway. Those landscapes, or let's say artificial ecologies, they're not only bearing the limits of the highways, the infrastructures being, for example, very limited height of earth allowed on top of capping, but also they're relying on these infrastructures. They're fed by the water that are pumped out of the tunnel, for example. So it's really a mixture of industry and nature, because the traditional notion of a nature that is a background that can absorb whatever we are making in the city doesn't find its space in this kind of context. So we cannot have our city and to have a nature with a space reserved by it, but we simply, in many places, we have to mix them. There's no space for this kind of separation. Then I refer to something I'm reading now, the Escobar notion about the techno-nature, where also this kind of mixture is conceptualized. So when I come back to this territory, this is, I think, could be a potential to add another layer to this. The question is, the city-centered urbanization is also largely based on an ideology on nature. It's to say that if we make the city very compact, we can have the nature absorbing the pollution, all the things that the city makes to neutralize the impact of the city. But maybe through the work I've presented to you, it's very hard to imagine in this kind of condition, we can have a city, the nature, the agriculture, all separated. We don't have the space. Maybe this is another starting point to think a mixture, how this can be a city answering some of the challenges of the climate change and our nature crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. Please, Cristiana.
Thank you very much, John, Antoine, and Qinyi for your presentation. Maybe we can hit the partage d'écran. Thank you. Yes, the three presentations are rather different, but I think that you talk about transition, cultural transition, ecological transition, and yes, agricultural, or you talk about territory and city transition. I have the first question for John. You have shown very interesting results of your work, and you have shown a lot of young students in the movie working with you. And your big question is how can we transform, how can we be architect today? How can we transform our profession? And my question is, what do you think about teaching architecture? How do you learn to the young generation this cultural transition, this new collective language in architecture?
Wow, the big questions. No, but just to be very quick, first of all, I think it's always interesting to try to link the research to the design, you know, and I think for me, this is always quite an interesting challenge. The analysis, you know, how do you go from analysis into design? And that's fundamental to working, I think, as an architect. So for us, it's really that to go right to the basics. I think design really starts with how you see the world. And just to look at the world in an architectural way, it's really you're acting as an architect. So in our projects, we're very much trying to involve the students into the research and the design. So they are going as well to document, interview villagers. And then when we are working with the design, it's not to present it as a kind of right answer. They're of course getting an experience with architecture to participate, but it's also learning from how people are actually adapting their own houses, you know, like engaging that and in a sense responding to that. The design process itself is pretty interesting because we're not designing everything. There's carpenters, there's traditional craftsmen, there's the government, and then there's villagers who own the house. One thing is that the first project we made was with villagers that had already transformed their tulo into a small school. So the design problem only came about because of, you know, a much larger transformation that they're already reacting to. And I think then they really are participating in the large, you know, in the entire story of what's happening there. Yeah, I don't know if it's possible to teach architecture, like to teach any sort of design ideas, but perhaps just careful looking.
Yes, very, very well. And I want to ask to Antoine, in your approach, in this bottom-up approach, what is the place for nature, for all these? Maybe we can speak about green and blue frames of the territory, because you have shown a lot of beautiful drawings and analysis of the territory, and how you can understand and integrate nature and green or blue frames in your work in this bottom-up, through this bottom-up approach.
Thank you for the question. First, I've been very interested in the author's presentation, because they are our three presentations are very linked and at different scale. And what we show that we have to get rid of the idea that because the metropolis is bigness, the solution is bigness, and the solution could be as well could lie in an aggregation of small elements and a network of small projects too. And what I try to show, I agree that I show mainly something about built-up areas, but in the approach of sustainability in those countryside, what I wanted to show is that the countryside could bring a lot of sustainability to the very center of the metropolis, and we have to observe the countryside as an archipelago of built areas among the natural environment, and the strength of countryside is the link between built-up areas and open spaces. I agree with you. We have to look more precisely to the open spaces, but that's the next step of our research.
Thank you. And Qinyi, your research is really very rich, and I have a question linked to stakeholders. How do you think the new relation with the stakeholders, with urban actors or politicians, which can help architects or landscapers to realize this transition, this agricultural, ecological, and metropolitan transition?
Oh, thank you, and I am very honored to be here to present and to discuss with you. Yeah, I think in China, it's true that maybe different from Europe and the Western world in general, that the urban transformation is highly guided by the policy. And not only policy, but ideologically guided by the upper constructions. So you can see that maybe I didn't explain it very clear in the beginning. Let's say when the country is established, the idea was to really build, to industrialize the countryside, because we don't have the resources to put everybody into the city. So the idea of units, the commune, and everything was constructed around this concept. And it's only from the 90s these big cities start to grow, because at that moment China is willing to open up and connect more to the global economy and so on. So, but at the same time, we see a lot of problems. So let's say the policymakers will give different ideologies. For example, beautiful countryside. What is the solution if we have all the big cities? What is the solution for the countryside? Let's make some beautiful countryside. Let's make beautiful villages. What do they mean? Do they mean to erase all the existing tissues as I represent to you? They are not beautiful. They are not traditional. Let's erase them and build, let's say, new towns with very modern tissues, modern houses. Or what it is? It's a constant research on paradigm. We don't know. It's not about whose interest. Everybody is trying to follow the policy, but also trying to interpret the policy and try to find their way. For example, maybe you know the towns. At one moment, China is saying, okay, let's stop the big cities. Let's develop a lot of small towns in the countryside, but without giving a very clear instruction. What does it mean? What is our ambition? What is our goal to do that? Then it becomes everything. You can have tons of chocolate towns, a town that is completely just making chocolates, that is completely detached from the context and so on. So I think instead of diving into this, my work clearly is not ready to answer this question. So the gesture is to say, we step back, we see what is there, what is this situation. For example, the house that I present to you, that the upper floors are those very big houses. They're not parents' house anymore. They are small buildings with the top part that are rented out to the new incomers. When we are erasing this countryside, we are not understanding that we are erasing all these capacities. The countryside is building by itself an incredible capacity with incredible embodied energy and effort to make all these volumes that can be used to house a big population. But during the construction of the new towns, we are just erasing them. So I think before the stakeholder and all these things, we try to understand what is the reality.
And Andrea, maybe you want to ask something to our...
Yes, First of all, I would like to thank everyone once again for those presentations and the way that they were somehow synchronized. And I think there is perhaps an emerging aspect that captured my attention widely in all of the three presentations, starting from John Lean with this idea of understanding the symbiosis through a collision, which provide somehow a new redefinition, a possibility to redefine aesthetics. And aesthetics related to this informality of people creating a new addition and transformation of their houses beyond the idea of heritage, which is purist and perfectly preserved, and at the same time beyond, if you want, a kind of way that architects conceptualize the form and shape with a kind of purity as well. And if I also combine this with what Antoine has shown about the local scale as a place of social informality, once again, as a place in which we have an emergent process of continuous spatial metabolism, perhaps there are 2 points that are emerging in my opinion. On one hand, which is the role of architects as a delegate of society, if I use the expression of Paulo Borghese. And another one is perhaps we are in front of a possibility to redefine a new aesthetic, which is a fundamental aspect of our discipline as well as architects, how we conceptualize the aesthetic, because if concluding, we link this to what Qinyi mentioned about the beautiful countryside. So aesthetics is again one engaging concept, which in Chinese context, for example, was also very relevant in even the Chinese philosophy. So if you would like to add a comment perhaps of these 2 points that I had to this discussion would be wonderful.
Could I say something? I just wanted to offer one thing, because also it's a little bit what Qinyi ended with. On one hand, I think it's very important to look very closely at what is happening. But on the other hand, I also think that the countryside is an idea, and that's what's also, in a certain way, the narrative of, especially in China, what's happening in Europe. I mean, I'm in Venice right now. And I think this idea or this ideal is so powerful and in everyday life beyond architecture. And, I think there's a lot of, we're kind of touching upon how this idea is what is really transforming, underneath the built form. And, even the aesthetic, I think that it's, in a sense, just simply a reflection of the transformation of how people are relating to this idea. And I think there's a real draw to this idea, because I think there's a question of diversity, actually. If you go to cities, you increasingly feel that they are quite similar, how you live, or, where you get into the kinds of spaces that you live, especially, I think, in China, and I think there's still incredible diversity that exists in the countryside itself. Through what I appreciate about my 2 other presenters, their work is that once you start to look very carefully, you don't see a uniformity. There's a lot of nuance, a lot of diversity there, and that's the way to, I think, bring out the diversity, the richness of the countryside, and essentially to, in a way, suspend the the idea of like the city and the countryside. We're really talking a lot about neither or, but the idea of this is still very powerful and useful. I'm interested in how a lot of the conversation is a real new combination of these ideas, or a new ideal, I think.
Thank you, John.
There are some questions from the participant.
I have.
Yes, we have one. We have one.
Can I have a question?
Yeah, please.
Yes.
The question is, it's from a dilemma that, in fact, I think also in my work, that when we look at the countryside, it's very easy that we start to fall in love with it, and we start to try to learn things from it. Does it provide us a good reading of the, I mean, the traditional rural area? Do they present a kind of rationality? Yes. Do they give us some lessons? Yes. Do they form a base for imagination, or simply a base to maintain this territory from collapsing? Yes. But at the same time, in the light of climate change, in the light of the different transitions, do they provide already a paradigm for us to apply or go back to? No. And because they, for example, all these industries in the continent, they are really polluting, and when they can do it, there are, so it becomes a very delicate position we have to take, that what we learn from it.
Thank you. Shaudi has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Our professor gave us very fantastic, very interesting lectures for me. And I have a question because I'm a PhD student of Dr. Jenny Talamini, and my PhD research direction are also very interested in government strategies and people's tactics, citizens' tactics, and I'm very interested in both everyday life. And I have a question on Dr. John Lee's lectures, because like I can see some everyday creativities in when people create their own buildings, their own dwellings. But I want to ask, what's your ideas? You keep the positive or negative some means for the phenomenon, because I think some buildings, I love some buildings, but some buildings I'm confused because some mixed with the materials and mixed with the forms. So what's your ideas about this, about the phenomenon, about people's everyday creativities? Because one more thing, because like the Dr. Zhang said, the beautiful countryside, because Chinese government want to build some beautiful countryside. But if we follow people's everyday creativity, maybe some buildings not very beautiful. So what's your ideas about this phenomenon? Thank you very much.
I think it's a great question. And I was actually thinking about what Qinyi was saying about the romanticization of the countryside, you know, and I think you could look at the work we're doing, and it is about everyday beauty, you know, so there's something romantic about this search, but it is also, I think, also about resisting a kind of common and easy romanticization of the countryside. It was a real lesson. I mean, for us, we were almost, how do you find these houses? I mean, we were almost looking for the most controversial examples, things you don't think are look like architecture. And then when you get very close to that, you realize everything is done for a very good reason. So there is an incredible intelligence in it, because for people with very little means, you know, there's no squandering of money. There's no excessive, you know, stylization, or, you know, to get back to this question of the aesthetic, you know, it's simply, they become pure reflections of a changing livelihood. And a great inspiration for me is that they represent people who are able to live in extremely modern ways, like the Taobao villages, you know, so they're taking their commerce, they're still making money through internet commerce. There's this incredible infrastructure, and they're just as advanced in people in San Francisco. And yet they also are farming in the backyard, and it's seamless. I find this really interesting, that, you know, in our minds, we think these things are very separate, but yet it's possible to be both seamless, and then for these three generations of people to kind of live together and be incredibly contemporary, incredibly traditional at the same time. Now, I think the question you're asking is, well, can this idea of the aestheticization of the beautiful countryside and the idea of the you know, how do they come together? Well, they are doing things in a very informal way. So I do think there's a space for participation, but not by taking a romantic ideal back to the countryside. You know, I'm not trying to be an architect who goes and studies the very traditional buildings and tries to revive these things, but rather, how can we make these things, what can we offer to them? Well, there's quite a lot, I would say. You know, like for instance, first question is this picture of this Tulo, where everybody simply invades the central space because they have their own bathroom and toilet. Well, it really just takes up the whole common space. You cannot use it for any collective activity, but you can understand why it's done. So you could imagine the architect could probably find a new way to do it, not just spatially, but even politically, to lead an arrangement or an organization for how you could keep the collective space and you could provide facilities for everybody. So I think the architect has, in a sense, very special roles that can be reinvented once coming to the countryside. This for me is also my interest in the countryside, you know, not to be in the city and to be an architect who is confined to making buildings. There's such a fixation on the power of buildings for architecture. I actually think the architect's real role can be elsewhere, especially when coming to the countryside. And as you know, this entire morning has been about the site is always changing. You know, to get back to the question of what do you teach students? Well, the site is not a stable thing. It is constantly in transformation. It might even be a stable piece of land, but the political, social transformations are, you know, it's constant. And this is, I think, is a very beautiful thing about architecture. You know, that we have a few programs, housing, house, school, library, but the architecture is always alive because the context is completely transforming all the time. So I don't know. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I look forward to talk with you more in the future. Thank you very much.
Very good. I don't know, Andrea, do you want to have the last word? Or, oh, we don't.
I also have some question if we still have some time. Cristiana,
Yes, Danny.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can take the last question. Yes.
Yeah, and also if we might take some very last question from our public as well. But my question, well, first of all, I would like to congratulate for the amazing presentation that, as Antoine was mentioning, very correctly to me, they are just at different scales, but they are basically presenting very similar phenomenon in a way. And all this is about, as John was mentioning, adaptation, transformation. And my question is, in your work, even if at different scale, what are the key principles that you want to put forward every time that you think about adaptation? What are the principles that are guiding, in a way, your work for all the three of you when you think about like this process of continuous transformation in these territories?
Thank you for your question. I think the main thing I want to say is that countryside is not only a landscape, but a very active space involved in global economy. And we have to be very careful about that. But it's true that there is still in countryside vernacular practices. And it was the word used by John Lin, I think, and by others. And it means those vernacular practices are very close to sustainability and close to sustainability in agriculture, even in construction, as we see. And that's true that we don't have to, we have to be very careful about the confusion between countryside and landscape, and have another way to look at those empty spaces. Wow.
Thank you, Antoine. Or Luke, do you have any comment on the Chinese question?
I speak for my cases. So when we do it, we set up the ambition from two scales. The first is more global scale, like starting from the sustainability, the zero emission, let's say the embodied energy, how to recycle as much as possible. From there, we develop concepts, like in my case, urbanization without new buildings. So start with the existing capacities that the buildings are having and so on. So this is one concept. But another one is really through the elements of everyday life. Like when you read The Living City by Frank Wright, or you read The Green City of Moscow by Okitovich, they speak really about life qualities. Like if you live in The Linear City by Okitovich, you will have vast views on both sides of your very small cell. You will have always double ventilations. He started with very simple architectural qualities, which in the big cities today, you don't have. Usually you have a lot of mono-oriented houses and so on. So he's not coming from big ideological, let's say, statements. So in fact, in my case, we also developed the idea to have a city that everybody has a view. View being a water, a forest, small woods, farmland. And this kind of city, you say every kid can go to the school by walking. You cross the farmland, you never encounter any cars. So you develop a city that you cannot imagine in the modern metropolitan cities. So the two level of, let's say, starting points.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
I wanted to make my last comment and I have to run, but I wanted to tie maybe the last question with the first one again, because for me, again, I think that we have to be careful of solutions. You know, and I think we live in a world where, politicians, the government, finance, the way the world is working is to look for common solutions, which of course, I understand that. I mean, like things like the phone, which is just for everyone. But I think architecture really exists in a very different way. You know, that there are solutions, but they can only be applied to specific questions. And we have to find the specific problem first. So for me, there's really then the role of the architect, I think, really rests in this, that every single place is fundamentally unique. And it's more important to discover that than to find solutions that can be applied, you know, or not to believe too much in these solutions.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much. Well. Thank you, John.
I think we have to close our session, Andrea. I have just one word about the question to reinvent our work, our profession, our way of teaching. It is very our discussions were very interesting, because we have learned together to ask new questions linked to this way of reinventing our profession or our way of teaching or researching, and not to have closed answer, but to give just new questions which can answer to the topic or to the question, to the new risk, new social risks, new climate change risk, or sample risk. And so it was my last word. I don't know if Andrea want to say something more.
Yes, thanks to everyone for attending this webinar and for your extra time. It was really, really appreciated. And we now close the webinar, and we will restart later with the second session of symbiotic urbanism. Thank you once again to all of the panelists and to Cristiana for chairing the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.